Welcome to another episode of Concussed, Understanding the Invisible Injury. And tonight I have a true expert, a psychotherapist, addiction counselor with the Liberation Place. It's his private practice. This is one of the best. He'll be joining me in just a couple seconds, Stephen Morris. We've got a very serious topic to talk about. I've been through it. I've got a tweet the other day from a gentleman in New Zealand. His name is Doug King, suggesting that a new report came out. We're going to talk about that with Stephen. I think it's really important for people to understand that there is a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of information when it comes to concussions, and we have to try and sort through it all. And I'm so honored to having Stephen Morris here to help me walk through it, to help you understand the myths, the facts, and of course, who can help us go through it. And this is one of those gentlemen, Stephen Morris.
Hey, Gooch.
Hi, Stephen. How are you, buddy?
Good, thanks, man. How are you?
Very, very good. I know I say this often. I want to thank you so much for being a part of us and helping people understand the world of concussions. There's a lot of people that don't understand that a concussion is really a sexy word for brain injury. And a lot of athletes use concussion because it doesn't sound as good. Hey, I'm concussed or I'm brain injured. The stigma changes a little bit. Listen, before we get into obviously the topic tonight, Stephen, why don't you talk to us a little bit about Stephen Morris? And of course, being an addiction counselor, being a psychotherapist, of course, with your own practice, Liberation Place, love to hear about it.
Yeah, so first of all, just on this subject, just want to say that obviously I'm not a medical doctor who knows the ins and outs of how the concussion affects the brain. What I am is I'm a registered psychotherapist in Canada with the CRPO, and I'm also a certified addiction counselor. I've worked over the number of years now with people who are dealing with addiction and mental health problems. I'm a person who's in recovery from addiction and mental health problems myself. And my work basically revolves around helping people to understand what the real issues are that are underneath the surface when it comes to addiction and mental health issues. So, depression, anxiety, any of the more what they call more serious mental health issues around schizophrenia and things like that. And obviously getting into addiction issues around substance use, process addictions like gambling and internet pornography, social media, helping people deal with anger issues that they might be experiencing, because anger for me is also an addictive behavior, codependent behaviors from family members who are dealing with addiction issues, all coming down to basically things that make us susceptible or vulnerable for these things. It's often referred to as a predisposition, and just working through things like unmet childhood needs and the reasons why we behave the way that we do, trying to cope with these vulnerabilities that we've got inside of us.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. What I like about you is that you articulate it so fine for people like ourselves that can kind of bring it down to the layman's terms, because it is very confusing. Obviously, anytime we deal with the brain, whether it be through a concussion, a TBI, or with drug and alcohol issues, people get scared. And as soon as somebody says, I was an addict or I am an addict, people automatically, it's like the plague, right? Obviously, you know my history with my sister. I still honestly believe this. After meeting you, I know it's a big call. I think we would have had my sister to be with us, just because the way you talked to me and the way you explained it to me, it allowed me to understand it way better. I felt guilt, and you certainly cleared that for me. Listen, we've got a lot of great people listening. One of the things that I wanted to, and the reason why we're touching on this right now, and of course with addiction counseling, we know just recently in the NHL, Jimmy Hayes had passed. A family man, a very good hockey player, history of concussions, was dealing with some drugs. His wife didn't even know that things were bad after he had cleaned himself up. Even his parents had said, I'm shocked. I was shocked. But as soon as I heard Jimmy Hayes had passed, we all kind of got the feeling something's not right. And of course, unfortunately, we did find out he did have a mixture of drugs and of course, fentanyl in his system. It's not just about professional athletes. It's a lot about, the average person, like my sister, very wealthy, very, very affluent, very educated, and yet she couldn't come down. That was not anything to deal with concussions. Talk to us a little bit about that, the stigma that comes along with it when somebody has an addiction. Prior to us talking about this topic that just came out of the AFL in Australia, talk to us a little bit about that.
You could have me talk about this all night if you want, Gooch. So the stigma is something that's I think we deal with on a daily basis when it comes to anybody that's been living any kind of an addictive lifestyle. As I said before, I'm somebody who's in recovery myself. I spent the better part of 20 years addicted to alcohol and drugs and a number of different processes along the way too. The issue is that in a lot of areas in society, addiction is seen as it's a choice. It's seen as it's a weakness. It's the person isn't strong enough to deal with life, and it's a very much it's seen as something that needs to be eradicated. It's there's something wrong with you. When all it is at the end of the day, any addiction that we're dealing with is a coping mechanism for underlying issues. Any of the one-on-one therapy that I do, or groups that I do, any talks that I do in the community, one of the biggest messages that I'm trying to get across to people is that addiction isn't the problem; it's the solution to the problem. And if we spend all of our time focusing on the solution, what we're doing is we're actually just focusing on what I call symptom management. So we're looking at the addiction instead of looking at what the true problem is, which is everything that's going on underneath the surface. Which for me, the vast majority of time, revolves around childhood trauma, revolves around unmet childhood needs, revolves around complex post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, underlying issues that basically the addiction becomes the coping mechanism for. And everybody's got coping mechanisms, every single one of us, and it's just about understanding that for people who deal with addiction, that is their coping mechanism. And if you just remove that coping mechanism, so somebody who drinks, for example, if you say to them, okay, you just need to stop drinking, if they just stop drinking, they just turn to something else to deal with it in such an extreme way. So they might turn to anger, they might turn to other people in becoming codependent, they might turn to other substances, they might turn to internet pornography, but they just turn to something else in order to cope because they don't have the skills to deal with what's going on underneath the surface and to cope with their emotional state when things go wrong or when things aren't going the way that they want them to go. So the stigma revolves around this misconception that people think, it's a weakness. It's there's something wrong with you. It's a choice that you're making, and it's absolutely nothing to do with that. When you look at it from the point of view of being a coping mechanism that everybody has. I mean, some people eat cookies when they get stressed out, or eat ice cream when they get stressed out, right? Try not do. I know we talked about that before. That's why I'm saying it.
It's chocolate. I love chocolate.
So it's like, try, next time you get like that, like I always use the example. I used to do a lot of work with family members of people that were dealing with addiction. And I always use the example of, if a parent's getting angry when their son or their daughter comes home, or their wife or their husband comes home and they're under the influence, and they've told them you can't be under the influence in the house anymore, and they come home and they get angry. The anger is that person's coping mechanism. So what I say to them is, next time he comes home or she comes home and she's in that state, don't get angry. And they're like, well, what do you mean? I have to get angry because that's how I'm going to deal with that situation. I say, yeah, try to stop yourself from getting angry, because if you can do that, if you understand what it takes for you to try to do that, now you've got a slight window into the world of the mind of somebody who's got an addictive lifestyle, because they're just using their coping mechanism in the same way as you're using anger.
Stephen, so well said. I can only say I got goosebumps thinking about this going back when I was dealing with my sister's addiction, specifically alcohol. I would be that person. Say, for God's sakes, Karen, can't you see those two beautiful children you have on the, look at those pictures. That are not enough. And I would get upset, and I would just fuel the fire. And all it did was come into confrontation. It was doing nobody any good. Certainly not myself. And once she was gone, I started to take that as somewhat a form of guilt, saying, God, I could have done more. Had I known you, Stephen, I would have been able to maybe, and please don't misunderstand that I'm trying to say that you're a God and you would, people need to I think you are. No, but seriously, people need to hear this. You just said it, dealing with, I thought I'm a pretty strong, tough guy. I've traveled the world, and yet I couldn't save my sister. Why? Because I didn't have the tools to do that. And so if we do get those tools, if we listen to somebody of you that has gone through it, has lived it, educated yourself on it, and give us the tools, and I'm going to say their tools to be able to do that. Not get how do you not get angry when you see this
Yeah.
beautiful person in front of you destroying their lives and everybody's life around you, including mine? Not destroying it, but
Yeah, no,
certainly
I understand.
causing. Yeah. And so I really like the way you put that in perspective. So I do want to now move on to why I wanted to have you on tonight. And I thought it was so relevant. Obviously, to Jimmy Hayes, I apologize. I should have said right off the bat, our condolences and our thoughts go out to the family, beautiful wife and children, and the mother and father still are reeling with it. His brother Kevin still plays in the National Hockey League. Wonderful guy. I've met Kevin, so I would be remiss not doing that. So we know that he dealt with some concussions. We then know that he became addicted to painkillers and then, of course, leading into other things. And we don't know why. Nobody could say, well, because he had concussions, he then started taking drugs. But we could assume that. I could assume that there could be a link between him being injured, not being able to play, then having to retire. And that in itself is traumatic. And you mentioned it may be a predisposition that allowed his chemical makeup in his brain and in his body makes him go down that path. And before I read this to you, I want to say when I read this, world first study of league players finds no link between concussions and depression risk. And I'm reading this. This is a funded study from the Aussie Rule Football, obviously looking at 133 males that played. What I'm thinking about is when I went through my traumatic experience, like suffering a concussion, being raced to a hospital, I was unconscious, waking up. Probably about 18 months later, it reared its ugly head. I was in anxiety, depression, because I knew there was something not right. I just don't understand how somebody could just come out and blatantly say this when there's so much more evidence to suggest. If you damage your brain, whether it be in a concussion or in a TBI, we do know it can create anxiety. Only common sense would say that, but I know the medical world is now saying that it does. And it can create depression because you're not who you used to be. Love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, it also not only anxiety and depression. There's a lot of the research that's been done shows that it can also bring on a lot of the symptoms that are associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, the important thing to understand about all that, I mean, for a number of years, the research that was done around concussions, up until it's only really been in the last decade or so, a lot of the research that was done around concussions was done in the military field. So we didn't have too much research really around like the sports stuff. It's really only in the last little while that it started to come out. Obviously, you know, I'm from England, so there's a lot of stuff around concussions. I don't know if you're aware over there around older football players, who are dealing with a lot of head injuries, a lot of early onset Alzheimer's and things like that as a result of heading that heavy ball that was around. So much so that now they're limiting the amount of heading that's done in training and things like that. But the thing to understand about it is we come back into the predisposition aspect of things. So anytime there is a mental health, an onset of mental health issues, whether it's depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, any of these, you know, significant mental health issues, there's usually some kind of a traumatic incident that brings it out, and it will come out as a result of like a genetic compound that's involved in there. So there's a predisposition, or I always call it a vulnerability, because predisposition is, I don't know, it's one of those words that sounds a little bit too medical for me. It's like there's a vulnerability to being susceptible to these kind of conditions. So the way that they do this, the study on this stuff to find out if there's a genetic component, is they look at twins and they say, you know, if this twin is, if both twins are experiencing it, high levels, then obviously there must be a genetic component to it. If one twin isn't and one twin is it a nature versus nurture thing? So is it the environment that they're in? And they study all this stuff and come out whether there's genetic predispositions or vulnerabilities to things. So depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, things like that. There's basically a combination of genetics that come together to make people susceptible or vulnerable to developing these things. So things like clinical depression, social anxiety. Now, if you experience a head trauma, that's going to be a significant enough trauma to kind of bring that out, to bring it to the forefront in your genetics. When you throw in the impact to your social life, when you throw in the impact to your ability to perform at a sporting level, now you're bringing up even more depression, even more anxiety, and you're also talking about the symptoms of what's called post-traumatic stress disorder. So things like emotion regulation, things like your relationships with people can become, interpersonal relationships become problematic because you don't know what's going on. Your fear levels are through the roof, and you become extremely hypervigilant about things. So always worrying that something bad is going to happen. And in the short term, all of the studies show that head trauma, so traumatic brain injuries, concussions, things like that, can bring these symptoms out for up to a period of 2 years. The thing that I noticed about the study that you talked about when you sent it to me and asked me to take a look at it was that they were talking about the time period when people are transitioning out of professional sports into kind of life after professional sports, and saying that there's no connection between people who've experienced concussions and then experiencing anxiety and depression and revolving around that. But they're not looking at the time in that year or two after somebody's significantly who's had that impact, and then the level of depression and anxiety that they experience as a result of the head trauma in that short period afterwards, and the impact that has on their social life, their ability to function, their sporting abilities, and it's a significant number of people who experience the head traumas that then go through those mental health issues.
Well, of course, it's a very complex story. Everybody's trying to find the right direction. Obviously, pro sport wants to protect their culture, and yet we do hear things like this that just came out. They're making a statement. Chris Nowinski wrote, "Amazed to see an NRL, which is a National Rugby League funded study, finding a mind-boggling 30% depression rate among retired players." This spun into that article saying that it seems that head impacts overblow this. And I don't think this is overblown by any means. I think it's a study that really needs to now be looked into, because as this was presented a couple of days ago, and I want to thank Doug King, an expert on concussion in New Zealand. He deals with a lot of the rugby related sports. He sent me this: the death of Sean Wanui is being treated as a suspected suicide, the coroner has confirmed. The 25-year-old professional rugby player died on October 18th in Bay of Plenty. The case is being treated as a suspected suicide. He did suffer from mental illness created, as they depict, from the fact that he had concussions and then could no longer play. Again, I am not a doctor. I know that you're not a medical doctor when it comes to this, but we can use some common sense. I can talk from a personal situation. Am I an enigma? I doubt it. So I'm thinking that when we read these type of things, we have to take it serious. And before you comment on this, this is one, you mentioned that you were from England. Here's a study that comes out of it was actually reported by your Daily Mail in UK, and they reported a third of children who suffer concussions go on to develop anxiety, depression, or other mental health issues that can last for years. The study was done in Australia at the Murdoch Children Research Institute, but they wanted to see how that affects their youth. Because if it's happening there, as we know, brain injuries, whether it's a concussion or TBI, don't know age, don't know gender, don't know our social status, certainly don't take weekends off, and don't know borders. So if it's happening there at that rate, we would assume it's very similar, whether it's football, which you talked about, rugby, or American football, or even for that matter, ice hockey here in North America. Bring us to understand that, because it is very complex for the average person, but important for a parent who's choosing their kids to play sport to understand there is a risk. We just want to try and mitigate that risk by educating them.
Yeah, I mean, whenever you're getting into any kind of contact sport, right, there's always going to be a risk of injury. And head injury is something that we want to try to avoid as much as possible. Obviously, I feel like I'm stating the obvious there, but just understanding the impacts to the brain. Basically, from my point of view, the way that I work with it is understanding the mental health aspect of it. So there's so much evidence that shows, as we've been talking about a few times already, that there is a significant risk of depression, of anxiety. What that leads to then is a completely different outlook on life. So, if you're looking at it from a child's point of view, experiencing depression, behaviorally they're going to change significantly. A lot of people don't. One of the things I think that's very important to understand as well is a lot of people don't understand the symptoms of depression in particular. Most people think of it as being just a sadness, for example, like this very flat affect, not being involved in things. Those are the very common symptoms that people get of depression. But there are also some asymptomatic things that come up for people. So things that you wouldn't normally associate with depression, things like outbursts of anger. A lot of people don't understand that for people who are dealing with a lot of irritability, a lot of anger, that can be a manifestation of a depressive state that's underneath the surface. So if we don't know how to cope with the sadness that's coming up as a result of the depression, we can turn to coping mechanisms to try to deal with it. And one of the things that can come up is this anger, these outbursts of rage and aggression. And quite often in children, that will play out in school settings, in sports settings, when they're dealing with these underlying issues underneath the surface and not knowing how to cope with them, that it will come out in those flashes of aggression and rage that parents don't understand can be associated with a depressive state as well.
Yes, and there was a movie that came out, Concussions, with Will
Yeah,
Smith, and it really showed you with the Pittsburgh Steelers that whole analogy of concussions and later life, this aggression that came in a lot of the linemen. It's a phenomenal movie. If you get a chance, take a peek at it. Listen, I want to do a shout out to Jeff Lieberman. Our thoughts and prayers are with you, obviously, with your late wife passing away from cirrhosis, obviously dealing with addiction issues herself. You've been a big support of us. Thank you for being there. Robert Wine makes a statement here. I think you know Robert. Have you met or you've seen him on our show? Robert was part of the Canada Five, has a visible brain injury, and of course physically disabled. Just a wonderful guy. And he's saying, I'm shaking my head if anybody simply dismisses the links between head trauma and behavioral issues. And I want to say, out of the Boston University in June 26, 2020, they did the largest study of its kind. An association has been found in living patients exposed to repetitive head impacts and the difficulties with cognitive functioning and depression years later, decades later, even.
yeah,
Again, I'm not here to completely chastise the AFL and NRL, but what I am doing is I want people to understand we need to look at this closely. We need to not just read the surface, but dig in deeper. And I know that's what
yeah,
you did with the findings. And I've then educated myself a little bit and read some articles to find out, because I didn't want to say, no, it's right. There is no link. Not only with a personal relationship, but also watching other players that I know that they're. I know a couple of guys in my hockey career that now looking back, their personalities changed. There was a huge
yeah,
difference between a couple. A couple of them, very mild manner, very good hockey players. Over years, all of a sudden, the career was over. They started drinking more. They became
right,
very vocal, very aggressive, and it was out of character. And then I had one specific, obviously, I won't mention names, and I'm sure a lot of us can talk about this if you played professional sport at a high level. I had one that was a complete opposite. He was absolutely a tyrant on the ice, fighting. He was one of those security guards for us more talented players. We loved him, and after his career was done, he just went into this very I don't even non-committal, not enjoying life. And I think that we do have to look deeper into this, because it's up to us as the adults in the picture to make sure we at least mitigate the risk,
yeah.
understand the risk, and then of course find ways, as we change rules in sport, or we take players out earlier and keep them out longer. That certainly helps us.
Yeah, I think over the last few years, I've worked with a number of different people who've come out of competing at a really high level in sports. Like even some baseball players, a couple of hockey players, a couple of lacrosse guys. That when they're transitioning out of that particular sporting role, if there is like a history of concussions, if there is a predisposition for any kind of mental health issues coming up. So things like depression, things like anxiety, when they're transitioning out of that particular sporting life, where there's been a massive focus on this is what I'm doing to cope with anything. It's an escape from outside of life. If there's other issues with family, if there's other issues with social anxiety or anything like that, like depressive states itself, the coping mechanism for it becomes the sporting life. So in a head trauma situation, if that is suddenly taken away, and there is a vulnerability or a susceptibility for these depressive states, anxiety, things like that to come out, then you better believe that that's going to suddenly come to the forefront. And the examples that you just gave there, Gooch, there's people who are basically self-medicating with substances, trying to deal with what the underlying issue is. Again, like the alcohol use in those situations that you're referring to, or the drug use in those situations that you're referring to, isn't the problem. It's the solution to the problem. The problem is the fact that as a result of these repeated head traumas, they've now developed this depressive state or this anxious state. They're transitioning out of their coping mechanism, which was the sports life, and now they don't have the skills to deal with it. Plus, they've got these underlying issues. So, you know what? I'm going to turn to substances because it numbs that particular situation for me and allows me to kind of function, if you like. I'm not thriving, but I'm existing and I'm functioning at a level where I'm not thinking about, suicidal ideation, for example. The level of suicidal ideation that increases when somebody's had a head trauma is absolutely huge. So just being aware of that and understanding the way that, particularly when people have to transition out of a sporting life as a result of these injuries, if there is a predisposition for depression or for anxiety or even things like schizophrenia, that head trauma will bring it to the forefront of the experience. And now that person's looking for a way to cope with it. And also remember that they're coming from, this is another thing I think is really important with the people that I've worked with, they're coming from a way of life that's not too open to talking about mental health issues and a thought process around, obviously I think now we're starting to talk about it a lot more, but there's still a lot of people who are afraid to talk about mental health issues, who don't want to talk about depression, particularly in males that have come from that kind of background. We were told as kids, suck it up, buttercup, boys don't cry, you don't talk about your
Yes.
emotions like that kind of a reaction. So we learn at an early age that if I talk about my emotions, if I talk about my feelings, then I don't get my emotional needs met. So in other words, if I talk about my feelings, you won't love me. So we suppress it and we push it down and we don't want to deal with it. Now, when we're transitioning out of a particular sporting environment where, it's revolved around that male libido and that whole, that testosterone and being
Macho.
man, the machism, macho, you said it.
Ism. Yeah.
To suddenly then say, okay, now you've got to be vulnerable and talk about the fact that you're dealing with depression and anxiety. There's a lot of people who just want to suppress that with substance or, process addictions like pornography or sex, things where they're just literally trying to suppress what's really going on underneath the surface because they don't feel comfortable enough to talk about it.
Well, that is so true. And there's a couple of people that I've gone through in my past that had a gambling addiction. They had an alcohol addiction before, drugs. They got off that, and then they turned to gambling. And I didn't see it, right? And they were
Yeah,
close to me. And I think you're absolutely right when we have to try and navigate that very fine line of an athlete, either him or her coming out of a career where the adulation is big, the noise is loud, then all of a sudden the light switch is turned off and you're in darkness. Now you have to be with yourself.
yeah,
Can it be just that in itself drives you to the loneliness? I can only say from my sister's standpoint, she used alcohol to be her friend. And she actually, in one of
yeah,
her last statements, stated, she was lonely and that alcohol was her best friend. The bottle
yeah,
of vodka was her best friend. So I think we have to watch how we analyze this, whether it is truly just a concussion. But think about this for a second. let's say you have a long career, you play as long as I did, and I had concussions. Maybe I would have came out with an ability, maybe not to communicate. I was given the
Yeah.
gift of gab, but maybe because of my concussions, it altered the way I was personally, and I came out after having a long career and dealing with a brain injury and having to navigate the system and try to get a job, but I can't. How can I get a job if I'm dealing with the aftermaths of all the things that I had during my career, and one of them being a brain injury? So we have
Right.
to really look at what the root cause is, as you
Exactly.
mentioned, and not as the coping mechanism, which is alcohol, addiction, gambling, and the rest. Hey, listen, I'm so excited to be able to talk with Stephen Morris. Not only is he an addiction counselor, but he's a psychotherapist with his own private practice, The Liberation Place. And I'll tell you what, I've been very honored to have you not only on my shows, but every time I reach out to you and ask you to help, you're there to help, which is fantastic. I also want to thank Fired Up Network. They've become a big part of us. They're spreading the word to over 100 different networks, which is fantastic. Terry and Joe do a fantastic job. And of course, ATS TV with Glenn Munford. We are getting able to spread the news and the understanding of concussed, understanding the invisible injury. Talk to us, just before we let you go, talk to us about your personal, how are you able to come through? Because it's all, there is not one size fits all. There's not a therapy. Again, it's not that light switch where you can, hey, stop drinking and turn the light on. Oh, I see the light. How did you come through it? What got you through those moments? And I only think back to when I give a dollar to somebody that's maybe on the road, and I give it to them. They say, "Well, Gooch, why do you do that? It's only giving them money for alcohol." And my thought was, when I saw my sister going through it, you know what? That dollar may give them the alcohol to allow them to wake up tomorrow and be able to be found. Either somebody finds them or they find themselves. If they, and so give me your thoughts on that and how you got through that very, very, very difficult process.
Yeah, I mean, my own story is is a long and complicated one, so it depends on how deep you want to get into it. I, started drinking at an early age. I was addicted to alcohol pretty much by the time I was in my late teens, early 20s. Got into all sorts of drugs when I moved to Canada when I was 24. And then I battled with knowing that I was basically an addict from probably, a lot of people were saying it to me when I was in my mid-20s, but I think I really came to terms with the fact that I was an addict and I was struggling with it when I was about 28, 29. Started to attend a lot of 12-step meetings to try and get out of the cycle that I was in, but I could never really go more than about 3 or 4 weeks without falling off the wagon, so to say. And really, it wasn't until I was about 37 when I eventually sobered up in the way that I have now. What got me through that particular experience was, number one, was the support that I had around me. But the most important thing was that so I'm not a huge believer in the term rock bottom. It gets thrown around quite a bit, he just hasn't hit his rock bottom yet. When he hits his rock bottom, things will change, because some people don't hit rock bottom, right? Some people just keep going until, unfortunately, it takes their life. For me, it's not about rock bottom. It's about seeing the motivation for change, right? So if my way of life is more comfortable for me right now than making the changes that I want to make, I'm going to stay in the place that's comfortable for me.
Yeah.
So it's about really seeing the motivation. For me, it was because I just saw the motivation for change. Right, I suddenly realized that living the way that I am isn't the way that I want to live, and I want to live that way. And I started to create the things that I wanted to do. So, pretty soon after sobering up, I realized that I wanted to help other people. In a way that kind of hindered my recovery, because I went into a lot of codependent relationships. But I also, that got me through the early part of my own journey. But ultimately, like having that motivation, that drive, that purpose, like seeing my life as being something that I wanted to live, was the thing that actually changed my point of view and gave me the motivation to make the changes. And that was a lot to do with the people that were around me, but also my own internal dialogue and recognizing what I wanted my purpose to be, and making the changes to put that in place.
Very good, very well said. I listen to a lot of people say to me, "You have to wait till your sister hits rock bottom." I didn't even know what that meant because we
Yeah.
went deeper and deeper. We'd get better, but then we'd go deeper and deeper. And I'm saying, God, how much deeper and rock bottomish can we go? And then the other one, and this is the final question for you. I want to have you back in a couple of weeks. I want to talk about again now that society is opening up.
Mhm.
We've talked about this several times. I've had people this week even ask me, you're planning events, you're looking at a future. I can't even get out of the house right now because I'm still so, God bless it, scared. I'd love to
Yeah.
talk to you about that. So here's my final point to you, and I want to understand this one because I kept hearing all the time. My sister was down and out. Obviously, we're talking about concussion. She didn't suffer from concussion, so I want to make that very clear. But she represented a lot of guys that I've watched go through this, and I kept hearing the thing, tough love. You got to
Yeah.
give her tough love. Please tell me if it's right or wrong because I never believed in it, and even though I still didn't get her to where I wanted her to get to, I still believe me not giving her tough love and allowing her to know, even when she passed, she knew I loved her more than anything in the world, and I would not cross the line of tough love. Is it a true thing? Should people be tough love, or should it be what you said earlier, when they came home, instead of yelling and screaming at them, maybe show them the respect that you understand what they're going through. I'm here to listen. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, it's I used to facilitate a family meeting in Toronto for a number of years, and quite often I'd hear people come into that meeting who were dealing with sons, daughters, husbands, wives, aunts, uncles who were heavily addicted to different substances. And quite often you'd hear people come in and sit down in this meeting. We get like 30, 40, sometimes 50 people at these meetings, and you'd hear people sit down and say, "Oh, you've just got to give them tough love." And my reaction to that was always the same. I would say, what does that mean? What does it mean to give tough love? Because if it means just like kicking them out and ignoring them, you're probably, the chances of that working are pretty slim. Yeah, it does work in some situations, but it's a very extreme reaction to a situation that most people who are dealing with addictive lifestyles, whether it's as a result of a concussion or just circumstances in life that have developed to have them use that as a coping mechanism. Most people's underlying issues, the main thing that they're really struggling with, is loneliness, guilt, and shame. So if we resort to just kicking them out and saying, that's it, I'm not talking to you
Good
anymore
luck. Yeah.
until you stop doing what you're doing. Actually, what you end up doing is usually you end up driving them into more guilt and shame and more loneliness. So it kind of compounds the underlying issues that the person is using the substance to escape from. So it is a fine line, because obviously you don't want to be enabling the person to participate in their substance of choice all the time. But it's really about setting boundaries and understanding how to listen to somebody, how to provide a space for somebody to feel comfortable enough to talk about things, but also not enable the behaviors. So one of the things I used to do in that meeting was try to teach people how to do that. In conversation, learning how to communicate with people, how you're feeling and what you need from them. Because a lot of the times when we talk about setting boundaries, a lot of people try to do it from a point of view as this is what I want, rather than this is what I need from you. Right. So, setting boundaries from that point of view and learning how to communicate how you feel. Because if you're in a situation where you've got a loved one who's struggling with substance use, you're in recovery too. Right.
Yes.
Because addiction is a family disease, and it impacts every single person that's in that environment. So when somebody's living in the environment with somebody who's actively using substances and is addicted to them, they're in recovery too. And you're trying to work a recovery model, because you can guarantee that the vast majority of people in that environment are dealing with some form of codependency, which is an addictive lifestyle in itself.
Stephen Morris, I can't thank you enough, of course, psychotherapist, the liberation place. people are able to get a hold of you going through, obviously, your website, theliberationplace.com. That's how they can get a hold of you. Obviously, if you or loved ones are suffering, you can always reach out to me and I will definitely get you in touch with Stephen Morris. You've been there all the time for us. I look forward to having you on in a couple of weeks to now look
Yeah,
at another, I would almost call it the pandemic, now an epidemic of getting people to get ready to open up again once it's safe and there is a true green light, because there's a lot of people that don't believe this green light is really ready. It's more of an amber.
Gooch, I honestly really believe that this pandemic has hidden the North American epidemic of mental health and addiction issues. So, now that that pandemic is passing, we're going to be left with this epidemic of people who are dealing with mental health and addiction issues that's been compounded as a result of the pandemic and the isolation that we've had to go through.
Well, I know that having people like you helping us through it, we are in a better place. Stephen Morris, thank you very much. Look forward to talking in a couple of weeks. Thank you for jumping on and talking about a very delicate topic. Stephen
No
Morris,
problem.
thank
Thanks,
you.
man. Appreciate you having me.
Thank you. Well, I'll tell you what, I love the guy. Obviously, his heart is in the right place. And what I think is really important is to understand these are the type of people we need to listen to. Obviously, there's a lot of articles you can Google. Listen, I'm as soon as I got an ache in my back, I'm Google. What is it? I got a sore foot. I Google it. But realistically, this is a topic we can't just Google. This is where we need the experts helping us. So I'm really honored that we have him on. And next week, I'm bringing on a very special guest, Doug King. He is a concussion expert out of New Zealand. He was the one that brought to my attention this story about their feeling of rugby and the associations down under do not believe there is a correlation between concussions, TBIs, and of course, anxiety and depression. And obviously, we need more study. We shouldn't be saying that there isn't. It's not definitive, but we can all see with common sense. If you damage your brain, you certainly will end up dealing with some sort of mental issue. And I look forward to talking to Doug King about that. All right. Thank you for taking time out on a night that there's a lot of hockey going on. And of course, the baseball. Don't forget to check out the Atlanta Braves. I'm cheering for them. Obviously, with Houston, love to see them win again, but it'd be great to see the Atlanta Braves take the World Series. Thank you for joining us tonight on Concussed, Understanding the Invisible Injury, brought to you by those good people, Fired Up Network.